And we are good. Welcome to Junkyard Theory, folks. Today's guest is none other than Timothy Williams. He is a composer, orchestrator, and a conductor who's worked on amazing movies ranging from Pearl to Guardians of the Galaxy to Deadpool 2. That's a 300 poster right there. Watchmen, a little bit of Zack Snyder, quite a lot of superheroes, but all around awesomeness. Timothy, thank you so much for coming on board the show. And how you on?
Ayubowan. Yeah, so nice. Thank you so much for having me on. Thrilled to
My
be
pleasure.
thrilled to be here to chat with you.
Thrilled to have you here on board, good sir. And ever since I saw Pearl, I was really impressed with the score. Like I was telling you earlier as well. Like I loved the original movie. I loved X, and when it came to Pearl, the fact that both these movies were shot concurrently during the pandemic was intriguing enough to get my attention. I was waiting for Pearl, and when I watched it, the score is something that instantly I took notice of because it's set in an entirely different period, and I knew I wanted to get the composer on board the show. And here you are. But before we get down to Pearl, I see a lot of superhero movies. You've worked on that stuff too. So tell me about your origin story.
So my origin story is I moved to LA from I'm British Canadian originally, born in England, grew up in Canada. Um, and then moved back to England. But I moved to LA I'd done a little bit of film work, but really wanted to do more film work. So about 20 years ago, I made the plunge of moving to Los Angeles. And, my background was primarily composing. But I began to when I first moved to LA, I began to sort of do orchestration that was just where the doors seemed to open up. And so some of the early films that I began to orchestrate were 300 and Watchmen. And my neighbor was composer Tyler Bates, and uh, he very kindly started to bring me in to orchestrate his movies, but also sort of gave me some opportunities to write some cues, some additional music. And it was really for me um, an incredible way to learn about the craft, because you didn't have the whole risk of having to sort of deal directly with the studios. And when you first start out, there's so much to learn. You don't know what you don't know until you know that you don't know it. If that makes any sense. But I felt like I knew everything. I came in and very quickly realized I really didn't know anything. And I had a very solid music education. I had studied as a classical pianist, and I'd studied composition and conducting growing up. But film scoring is very different. My background was in music theater. That was kind of where I got my start. And since moving to LA, I've probably done close on 60 live projects for Disney. Most of the live shows you'll often see in the different parks
Yeah.
and on the ships. Some of the fireworks stuff, all that kind of stuff is stuff that they brought me in on to create because of my background in music theater. But moving over to film is such a different medium. And to be able to kind of come in and start writing cues for some of these incredible films was a great learning process, because I learned what worked, what didn't work. And Tyler very kindly had me not only orchestrate everything, but he was one of the people that actually said, "Why don't you get up there and conduct it?" I think 300 was literally one of the first films I ever conducted, so it was like being thrown in at the deep end. But I'm a big believer in learning as you go, like really, really just saying yes to every opportunity and really trying to sort of learn on the job. And you live in a state of terror for a little bit, but now 20 years later, I'm not. I love conducting films, and in the last 5 or 6 years, I actually get hired as a conductor independently for films by other composers. And I sort of split my time between writing scores and then working with other composers to orchestrate their material, which for me is a lot of fun, because it really is that whole left brain right brain thing.
Yeah.
When I'm creating and writing scores, I really get to sort of use that right brain creativity and really enjoy that freedom. But it's an exhausting place to live, and so it's nice sometimes to come in and have someone else create beautiful music and then take that and orchestrate it or conduct it, bring it to life, sort of left brain stuff. And I love that balance of being involved in different aspects of the industry. um, I mean, my favorite is still, I just love writing, and Pearl was a phenomenal opportunity to. It was just an incredible opportunity to write the kind of score that, um, you learn in film school, and you study those kind of incredible old scores, but modern scoring is very different. So you never really get that opportunity to write in that style. So when this opportunity came along, it was just an incredible way to explore different old style harmonies, different playing techniques. And yeah, it was just such a fun film to be involved in. And just it's a beautiful film. It's incredibly well acted. It's incredibly well edited and shot. I mean, it is a masterpiece. So, and it's amazing how when you do film scoring in general, if a film is well edited and well acted, the scoring process is so much easier, because film scoring is all about pacing. It's all about the flow of the movie, and that comes down to the editor's job. If the editor's done a really good job, and the scenes and the story unfold in a really interesting way, then as a composer you can come in and find that internal pacing. If it's badly edited, you're screwed. You're effectively screwed, because you're coming in trying to write music, and the scene's 5 seconds too long here, and then it cuts awkwardly to this. And so you're just sort of trying to get around all of the bad editing. And similarly, if it's not well acted, there's a sort of myth out there that, oh, the music will save this movie. Music can do a lot, but it can't save a bad movie. It can't save a bad story. It can't save a badly acted scene. You can help it, but it's, at the end of the day, it's always about the story and about the acting, and the way it's shot, and all that
True.
stuff has to be in place first. And if that's really done well, then, then the composing part of it is much, much easier.
True. Having said that, though, I think composers don't get enough credit for the amount of work that they put in, because you guys are literally, I mean, filmmakers in general. They play with everybody's emotions, but music sometimes takes the project from here to
It
right over
can.
there.
It can. If
Yeah.
you can, I mean, that's always the thing, that you want to do with the score, is try to elevate the film and bring something to it that, can help make it feel iconic. I mean, that's always my goal when I come in. There's a safe route, and then there's a risky route that could be way more interesting. And
Hmm.
again, that's up to the filmmakers. Some directors just are like, just give me the meat and potatoes. And then other directors come in and say, it's okay if you spice it up a bit. You do something interesting. I'm just finishing up a romantic, really funny, really great romantic comedy. And again, director is someone that I have a really great relationship with. And his the first question when you sit down with a director and sort of start delving into this process is always, what is the tone? What is the tone of the music? What's the language of the film? And you start from an infinite number of choices, and you begin to kind of focus in on what kind of style of music you want. And for this film, I said, I really think it'd be really cool to do percussion, like found percussion, unusual percussion, like coconuts
Hmm.
and things like that,
Yeah.
with some lower drums, taikos, and things like that, and vocals, female vocals only, stacked, doing these kind of rhythms against this percussion with lots of delay. And it's a very off the wall concept. Like, it's not at all what you might
Yeah.
expect. But I was just like, I really think that approach would create this really fun, interesting score. It's a really cool film, it's a rom-com, but it's basically a girl discovers a very handsome guy ghost in her room, and he's dead, but he's a ghost, but he's very attractive and funny, and the whole film is sort of unraveling why he's still there as the ghost and what happened in his life. And but they, they start out sort of hating each other, and then they sort of fall in love. But it's a really great premise, and I just wanted to have something that was, and of course it's set against the backdrop of high school, so I wanted something that felt really, really interesting and a bit off the
Yeah.
wall.
It sounds
um
really interesting. When can we see this?
So yeah, it's going into post. I'm not sure what the distribution. My hope would be it'll get some kind of a release at the end of this year.
Okay.
I mean, that's the strange thing about the job that I do is um, a lot of the projects that come out, there's a good year before we actually see them in the movie theaters, or they
Mm.
become, Pearl I wrote like over a year ago. So um,
Does that
it's
time?
funny because
Sorry. Yeah.
I was just gonna say it's funny because you post on something and oh my goodness, you're so busy, and it's like, well, actually, you're not allowed to talk about these things for years. So
Yeah.
they're all sort of, they've all been done. A lot of these projects are still COVID projects. They were done during COVID, and the stuff I'm doing now I can't talk about. Will probably come out later this year or early next year. So there's definitely a lag in terms of what you see and what can be discussed
Sure.
in terms of what you're working on. So it's always
Oh
very
yeah.
funny. Everyone's like, well, how come you doing so much? And it's like, this was last year's work.
Whenever, so I mean, that's a very interesting dynamic because as filmmakers, you create something it's taken such a long time, but when the audience sees it, it's probably, like you said, like a good year or two after it was all conceived, like all constructed together. The time between which you worked on this project versus when you actually see it, is the time period enough for you to kind of go in there and like objectively look at your work and be like, be like, oh, maybe that's actually good, like it's way better than I thought. Or you're like, I could have done so much better there, because like I have this thing where I can't really go back and look at the movies I've done, even like maybe years later. I'm like,
Oh, I'm the same. I'm absolutely
ah,
the same. I can't look at anything I've done. It's just it gets too personal. I do occasionally. I'm forced to with an opening or some kind of
hmm,
event that I have to go and watch, and I sit there and I go, oh, that sounds pretty good actually. But it's not something that I enjoy doing
hmm,
because you've composing for me is always in fits and starts. Some scenes just write flawlessly and you just feel like, oh yeah, that was just inspired. I don't know how I came up with that. And then other scenes are just you wrestle with and you wrestle with, and you end up doing 30 versions of it trying to find it. And you know the one thing I think a lot of film students never understand is time pressure.
oh yeah,
I had when we worked on Pearl, it was about 6 weeks to write that score, which when you think about it, for how much music is in it, is very, very fast. Most films are between 6 to 8 weeks in terms of the time you have to write the score. And you have an app. The way that film works is you have a dubbing deadline. In other words, there's that point where they're going to mix the film, and they're mixing the dialogue, the sound effects, and the music, and
yeah,
that is booked out. That doesn't change. And typically when people make films, you know at the beginning they have lots of money, lots of time. They go on a set, and it runs over time, and then they get into the editing, and it takes a lot longer than they originally thought. But that window of time between when you jump on the project and when you have to deliver it sort of gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And the dub date's always fixed. It's not something you can sort of say, oh, I need another 3 weeks. They're just like, that's the dub date, you got to deliver by then. And so when you're writing and you're under time pressure, it's often you just do the best possible job you can in a certain amount of time.
hmm,
And I always tell folk, they're always like, well, what do you feel about the dub date? We've got this date or that date. And my answer is always the same: more time is better. Give me more time with it, and I can go back and revise and try and improve it. So, but you're always fighting the clock. Um, and it was one of the things during COVID that I actually because everything sort of slowed down a bit during COVID. One of the things I focused on was getting my studio as fast and as efficient as it possibly could be. So I upgraded the computer and I got flash drives and anything that could improve speed, and rewired the studio, but anything that could give me an edge in terms of getting a cue done fast. If I was, waiting for anything, if there was lag or there was something that was
Yeah.
slowing me down, I spent all of COVID just trying to get the fastest, um, possible setup I could, because time is your big pressure. It's sometimes it's not the composing, it's the fact that the clock's running, and
Yeah.
you've only got a certain amount of time to deliver. And often if there's a recording session, again, that's booked even before the movies, even before you start. They're like, okay, well, the first recording session is 6 weeks from now.
Yeah.
So you're up against the clock. So that always affects your writing. You just, sometimes it flows and then sometimes you struggle, but the clock just keeps ticking. So that's the
That's something you can't really control.
no, and it's not something they'd really talk about in film school. It's funny because I one of the things I really enjoy doing is I have interns that come in and I help them with the craft, and to a person, every single one always is absolutely shocked by the speed. They'll sit
Mm.
there and they'll say, I'll be like, can you do this, orchestrate this cue today or work on this? And they'll be like, what, you're just giving me one day? And I'm like, yeah, actually I have to do it in 2 hours, but I'll give you the full day. And they're just like, we just had no idea, because at school you sit there and you're learning and they'll say, oh, you've got a semester to do this one piece.
Yeah.
They'll give you like 6 weeks to do one cue, and I'm like, yeah, we got to write 40 minutes of music in that same period of time.
Damn. Is the
So
pressure any better when it comes to working on independent films?
yeah, I mean, it is. There's definitely I like independent films in general, just because there's a lot more creative freedom. Um, and in general, the schedules are a little better, and they understand that. They'll be like, what, how much time do you need? And they can start to adjust things around it.
Yeah.
The studio films are much, much higher pressure because everything's in the calendar, everything's locked. And, just there's, the creative freedom is not quite the same, because often with these projects, there's a very clear mandate for what the score should be. We want this,
Yes.
Interestingly, that was one of the things when we started on Guardians, which I did some additional music for. We sort of come off Watchmen and began to go in, and one of the initial notes right off the bat was, the score's too dark, for Guardians that you're going. It needs to feel much more like a space opera. So that was something that tonally we were in the wrong place, and we had to kind of
Who does
shift
it,
it.
sorry, who does that note come from? Is it from the director or is it from the
It'll
studio?
come from the director and or the studio. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Because you initially have to, and that's, I think, always the challenge when you score a film anyway, is to find the right tone for the film.
Hmm.
That for me is always the biggest struggle with any film, is what's the right tone for this film. And sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes the temp score, which is a music they put in while they're editing, which is just there temporarily before you come in to score. Sometimes the temp score can be a big help, because you can watch the film down and immediately realize what in the temp is not working and what in the temp is working. And I usually find one or two cues in the temp that are like, oh yeah, that's definitely the right tone. These are all wrong, but this one here has, I think, an interesting jumping off point for the tone.
Helps you
Um,
kind of like pull on that thread and go down the rabbit hole.
yeah, yeah. But often I'll get films, especially in the independent world, there'll be no temp. This rom com that I just finished had absolutely no temp, like not even sort of indications of where music should be. So that has some advantages, in that one of the common things is, a director, by the time you get your movie, will have watched the film with the temp music, probably 60, 70 times. So they're quite
Mm.
used to the temp music. So they can develop what we call temp love, where they love the temp, and that's that, they can't hear it any other way.
Yeah.
So even if you bring them something better, they're like, well, but it's not this. So the one advantage of not having any temp is the director is not attached to anything, so it gives you a much bigger sort of clean slate to come in with, but you then have to do the heavy lifting of trying to find what is the music of this film, what has it got to be.
Yeah.
So you know, there's pros and cons on both sides. I personally, I don't mind temp if a film is well temped, it gives me the language of the film. Oh, it's an orchestral score, it's a, you know, it's a hybrid score, it's synth score, it's electronic, it's horror, it's an action. You get the feel of it, and you can see what's
Yeah.
working. So it does give you a little bit of a shortcut in terms of the tone of the film, but it's also fun to come in. I did a film, yeah, the one film I really enjoyed, about in 2019, was a film called We Summon the Darkness with Alexandria Daddario and Johnny Knoxville. It's a really fun. It's almost like a black comedy. It's pretty cool. It's pretty funny. But it was set in the 80s, and we wanted just to do this kind of 80s synth vibe
Same.
for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, again, that was really fun because it didn't really have a lot in terms of temp, and the temp that it had for me felt wrong. It felt like it should be much
Mm.
more kind of like um just kind of like a fun 80s vibe to it. So
Yeah.
I kind of went down that road, and just had a lot of fun, you know, because I normally write orchestral scores, so it's fun when you get to do an electronic score. Like any score that's kind of outside of what I normally do is fun, and Pearl was definitely in that category. And
Yeah.
um,
When do
uh,
you choose between purely digital music composition and orchestral? Like, is there a clear distinction between the two?
so basically, if I'm up for a film and they hire me as the composer on the film, then that would be my role on the film. When I started out, I would often do the orchestration myself, but more recently I've been having, you know, I have a really great orchestration team that helps me on these bigger films because we have so much music to do quickly. um, but on my own films, I prefer to have someone else orchestrate it. I still can't help being an orchestrator, looking at it and going, oh, I think I'm going to adjust this or adjust that. But it's when you're composing, you know, I want to keep my mind in a different place than when I'm orchestrating, which is much more about how do you practically get the composer's vision to the players, and have them play something that really represents what the composer's looking for. Um, you know, so when I'm hired as an orchestrator, it's usually by other composers. There's a bunch of incredibly talented composers that very kindly hire me to orchestrate, you know, their stuff. And as I say, that's a lot of fun. It's you're sort of the janitor of the music world. You kind of come in, and you often see this sort of very messy mock-up they've done, and you sort of have to just try and come in and clean it up and polish it a bit and make it playable for the players, and still preserve what it is that's so amazing about what they've done. But um that's sort of my analogy, is that you're the you know, the orchestrator is the janitor of the music world, and when you're conducting, you're sort of the traffic cop. You're telling people when to come in, when not to come in, and just kind of generally guiding the traffic of the music. So
So these two tasks are very technical, I take it, and then you have composing, which is like the more creative side of things. Yeah.
correct, yeah, exactly,
Right. Because
exactly.
I'm not really familiar with the conducting and orchestrating, but it's something like, I mean, never really worked with an orchestra or anything like that before, so this has all been kind of a mystery.
Yeah.
So the curtains being lifted right now, it's nice to get to know
And I,
more about this.
you know, and that was one of the things that I that was really part of the learning process for me. Was I come from sort of a classical background of music,
Hmm.
studying, you know, orchestral scores and studying piano. So when I first began to orchestrate, my whole mind went to, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, and we shouldn't be doing that, and we can't do
Hmm.
this. And it was the first film I ever orchestrated was a film called Slither, which was a James Gunn film
Yeah.
for Tyler Bates.
Okay.
And we pretty much, I orchestrated it pretty straight ahead with everybody in the room. we had like 90 players. I think we did it in Bratislava, and it was like 90 players, and we had the toms in the room, and you know, and it sounded fine, but it was, you know, when I came to 300, I began to think about how would it be possible to not limit myself to a standard orchestral lineup? How, because we're recording, we don't have to. So I
Mm.
began to sort of come up with this idea of doing a multiple passes, where we would do like a pass of, say, short strings that are very aggressive, and a pass of the longer melodic strings separately. So then I wasn't limited to just one, you know, and that sort of became the template for much of the way that I approached all these different films. You know, 300, Sucker Punch, Watchmen, you know, Guardians 1 and 2, Deadpool 2, they're all, if you look at the orchestrations, they all have this approach of, what if we have effectively two orchestras, one orchestra
Mhm.
that's handling all the big thematic material. So in Guardians, when you hear the theme kick in, you know, the da 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 da
Mhm.
dum bum bum, you know, I have the full brass on that, playing that melody with the strings, dum 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 da da dum, and then I have like another orchestra,
Mm.
you know, so we record that separately, doing all the gung gung da 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 dum da da dum dum,
Oh, okay, okay.
and the violins da 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 da, all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff is done separately.
Mhm.
Same with the brass, you know, I have all the brass on the melody, and then I have other brass sort of doing all that bum 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 bum, that kind of stuff. I
And
record
then
that
you
brass,
mix it all together
and then you
later
mix
on.
it all together, and then
Nice, nice.
you get a double orchestra, you get the size, but you get the clarity too, because um you know, the short stuff, you can use a bit less reverb, and you can compress it more so that it's really
Mm.
punchy, and then that sweeping stuff, you just let it be much more natural in the room. So this was something where I began to sort of think outside of a lot of these kind of standard approach, or these rules that come
Yeah.
with classical music, where you're playing something live and you have to do it with a full orchestra live. When you go into the recording world, you can use these tricks, but it was one of the things that I really had to fight when I first started writing, because I would start to write and I kept thinking, oh, we're going to run out of violins, we're going to run out of French horns, we're going to run out of this, because I was doing too many lines, or I was, you know,
Yeah.
I had to get to that point where I sort of said, look, I've got to get orchestrator Tim out of the room, and I've got to let composer Tim just do what he wants to do here, and be creative, and have, and we'll figure it out later, you
Yeah.
know, which is
No
the way.
compromises when you're creating.
Exactly, and it
Yeah.
took me a while to get that out of my head, that when I'm
Mm.
writing, there are no rules. I can do what I want, and just create, and not restrict myself.
Yeah.
Um, I took a long time to get to that place, because there was always that voice in my head going, "Well, how are you going to record this? How are you going to, you know?" And I just had to say, "Look, let the music be the music. If it's working, and the director likes it, and it's the right thing, you know, then you know, when I come to orchestration, I can be the janitor and clean it all up, and go, okay, well, now you've got 50 horns here. How are you going to how are you going to actually record it?" And you usually figure it out. You go, okay, well, we'll give some of that to the trombones, and we'll maybe use the trumpets here, and whatever. You work it out, but
Problem
I
solve it on.
uh,
Uh, yeah.
later. But
Yeah.
I think that's really important, because I do know a lot of composers who are starting out, who sometimes do limit themselves
Hmm.
with some of these rules. And I think that it's that the most important thing is really creating that music, that tone, that passion first, and serving the film, you know, and then figure it out later. Like you know, even I even do that with, even if it's like I start out non-orchestral. If there's a score that needs strings and I haven't worked that out in terms of the budget or the tone, I'll put strings in, and you know, often that'll be something that the director will go, "Oh, I love that. That's fantastic." And at that point, I go, "Okay, by the way, we now have strings. We got to record some strings somewhere." Um, but I think you have to think that way around. You know, you have
Yeah.
to let the creative be really fit the film, and not be restrained, even with ideas. Like you know, that's the thing.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's all about serving the film because like that. right there is God, and everybody kind of works towards serving and making the best possible product that you can,
Yeah,
telling the
yeah,
best
that's it.
story.
That's exactly it, and that even comes in the process because, you know, inevitably, some of my favorite cues are the ones that the director either doesn't like or get cut. You know, and you just have to sort of say, as much as you know love that. That in Brightburn was a great example of that.
Mm.
The film Brightburn. I'd written this. There's a sequence at the end of the film. I don't want to give any spoilers for people who may not have seen it, but um, you know, it's basically about, you know, Brightburn is about a kid who could theoretically have become Superman, but the question that's posed is what if he's more evilly inclined rather than good? And there's a very very climactic ending sequence of him hunting, you know,
Yeah.
and it's quite tragic in some senses, because it's, you know, family member. And I had originally scored it as one sort of big sweep that was actually almost like something out of The Godfather. It was very
Mhm.
emotional and very had a lot of counterpoint, and it built and it built, and it was playing the point of view of the emotion of the scene rather than the horror or the terror of the scene or the violence of the scene. I had
Yeah.
scored it, and it was really tricky because the director came in and said, I love this piece of music, it's fantastic, it's emotional, but I don't know if we should be playing the terror and the horror here more, you know.
Mm.
And so it was a difficult thing because it was one of the favorite pieces, you know, I'd ever written, and it was just beautiful. It was like a really emotional payoff for the movie. And
Yeah.
he was like, "No, there will be an emotional payoff, but it's not this scene. It's a bit later where we can go to that emotional place. But here it needs to still be terror and horror." And so I ended up scoring it that way. But that's a very much case of, you know, I'm serving the film, not not
Not yourself.
not myself. And
Yeah.
that's, you know, that's always the thing. If you want to serve yourself, you know, go and write an opera, go and write a, you know, that's the place to sort of sit there and go, oh wow, isn't this great? But
Yeah.
um when you're working on a film, as you say, the film is first, storytelling is first, the tone is first, and you have to you have to serve that. So
So that.
yeah,
Uh,
but sadly, inevitably, almost all of my favorite cues end up on the cutting room floor, you know, and I have
do
to
you
sort
ever
of
release these? Do you ever release them, or maybe on a
no,
website or
no,
Spotify? No.
because they
Okay.
end up not almost never getting recorded, because you move
You
on to
write them, but you don't really record
yeah,
them.
yeah. So I have loads of vaults of stuff that's mocked up, but um,
Talk to me a bit about test screenings.
the deadly test screenings. Yeah, test
Yeah.
screenings. So, yeah, I we'd sort of mentioned that as part of the process, and I think test screenings are a part of the part of the process now. And in some ways they can be very good because they can actually inform the filmmakers of what is working in their film, what people are responding to, and maybe what in the story is unclear, or what
Yeah.
isn't working for them, or what
Mm.
characters haven't been. And then they'll often go and do reshoots or re-edits after that,
Mm.
which
Mm.
obviously has an impact on music. Um, but certainly in the context of being creative, I think that's where test screenings can really sort of and focus groups can really limit your creativity, because certainly again on
Mm.
some of these bigger studio projects, um and I think we were sort of talking about it in the context of innovation, the innovation of Pearl, and Get Out was another movie that I worked
Yes.
on that was very innovative. And again, I think I personally, my favorite type of film is that film where the director gets to be the auteur of the film. Like he's the real sort of at beginning. And you look at the great films like Apocalypse Now or Godfather, you know,
Mm.
and these were classic Hollywood cases of producers pulling their hair out and the director just doing their own thing, and producers trying to tame directors and all that kind of stuff. Um, and it happens a lot more than you think. You know, the sort of tension between the director and the production company or the studio is very common. You'll often have a director's cut and a producer's cut, because the director sees it one way, and test screenings are often a way that certainly you can start to gauge. You can go out to the audience and gauge how our audiences responding to it, because ultimately they're the final judges of whether
Yeah.
whether they respond to it or not, and whether the film is impacting correctly. But one of the downsides of test groups and focus groups is that it really can sort of creatively start to push you towards kind of a central tone for the film.
Hmm.
Um, what I would call, as I referred to earlier, kind of like, here's the meat and potatoes, and the food can become very bland, no spice, nothing
Yeah.
interesting, um,
It's pretty template.
very template, yeah, and
Yeah.
a lot of jobs end up in that zone, and that's fine, and you write that because that's what they want, that's what they're paying you to write. The project's really cool and fun, and you want to hit a home run with it, and that's where you end up, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but um, for me, with independent films where that's a little bit less of the process, I think in general you tend to get a little bit more creativity, because you can come a little bit more from left field and try different things. You have the support of the director and a little bit, either you have producers that are very supportive of that process, or um, um, or give the director that freedom. And I personally think that's where a lot of really fantastic stuff occurs.
Yeah.
I think you look at someone like Ennio Morricone. I mean, he cut his teeth on spaghetti westerns,
Yeah.
and I mean, you think of just the iconic work. Like, it's really interesting. I watched a film the other day, and I was like, man, this score is fantastic. Who wrote it? And it's Ennio Morricone, and it's
Yeah.
so off the wall. It's just so off the wall. But you think of like that whole, doo 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 doo. I mean, it's just iconic, But
Exactly. Yeah.
spaghetti westerns were the fast and furious. They just went, they went to Italy. They
Mm.
just banged them out. Hired Clint Eastwood, banged them all out. And it was just kind of, let's churn these out, and yet the music, because of that freedom, was so interesting. And it can work and it cannot work. I mean, the Hollywood is filled with stories of iconic composers who've gotten fired because they've kind of done their thing, they've had their freedom.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the classic ones was Maurice Jarre, who did Lawrence of Arabia. Got fired from River Wild, having just done Mosquito Coast. They hired him on River Wild, and it wasn't sort of um it just wasn't sort of in the middle enough for them. So they brought
Yeah.
Jerry Goldsmith in to come in, and and as Jerry Goldsmith said, yeah, you always get fired at least once in this industry. He'd gotten let go on some projects, because he was coming in with a certain approach, and for the filmmakers it just didn't work. So it happens. It's very common, but uh, I think it's that very delicate line, isn't it, of trying to push the
Mm.
boundaries but still deliver what people need and want. It's trying to find innovation, and
I
um,
feel like you get, like you very correctly said earlier, you get to innovate more on independent films because you have a much longer leash, and it tends to
yeah,
be these kind of movies that actually set the newer trend,
yeah. Well, I mean,
and
look
then
at
the
look
studios
at
follow
yeah.
them.
I mean, look at Get Out. Get Out was a
Exactly.
very low budget film. It wasn't independent per se, but it was Blumhouse and
Yeah.
Universal distributed. But it was a very low budget film, and no one really knew what it was gonna do. And same with Pearl. Pearl was a very low budget film, but as was
We had
Brightburn.
Michael Abels on the show. He was one of the very first guests,
Yes, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That was such a treat working with him on that film. And uh, it really was a odd film to watch, because I remember when I first watched it, I went through it, and I just thought, this film is so off the wall. It's either gonna be lost on Netflix and no one will ever see it, or, I mean, that's really honestly where I thought it was going to go. And but it just had it. I thought it's such a great film. I hope this just
Yeah.
doesn't disappear. I've written, music for films on big projects and projects that have been buzzy and done well. But I've written a lot of, I think I'm up to 170 films now, and I've done,
Wow.
that I've worked on, not as a composer, but that I've conducted or orchestrated
Yeah.
and composed. But
That's still a big number.
yeah, but some of my favorite scores are on films that I'm sure no one will ever see unless you go deliberately search them out on Netflix. They're sort of in the back catalogs of Netflix,
True.
It's
True.
um, and you just never know how a film is going to do,
Hmm.
until it's
I think that's
released.
something you can't really gauge, no matter how many focus groups, test screens, whatever you have, right?
You can't.
It's
No,
yeah.
no. You and it's funny how, like, especially like this 2022 was really interesting because I think a lot of the films that were supposed to be the big kind of films of the year ended up just not doing anything because it's a very strange time after COVID. I think people are being very
True.
selective about what they're going to see. If they're going to go and risk going to a theater, they want it to be a great movie.
Yeah.
And it's interesting really watching the public taste because they're, some of the movies are um, unexpectedly doing well.
Hmm.
Um,
Do you feel
like
like they were kind of more exposed to more like different kind of content during the pandemic, where that
yeah,
home and streaming
yeah,
content that they normally don't go
yeah,
see?
it shifted. I
Yeah.
think it shifted tastes a bit because I mean I look
Hmm.
at some of the films that really kind of popped. And you have films like Barbarian, which was a great
Oh
horror
yeah.
film, but I mean it's a tiny little film and it
Hmm.
popped. Pearl was a tiny little film and it really popped. Uh, and I'm trying to think of some of the other. I won't name them, but there are some very big studio films that just failed
Yeah.
terribly. And interestingly, things like Top Gun, which were, I mean, that just exploded. I mean, you know, obviously that was the hope for Top Gun, but I mean,
Yeah.
for it to be nominated for Best Picture on a
That.
on a on a
Yeah.
jet on an action jet film is like, okay. And Avatar, same thing, got
Hmm.
nominated, and I mean, they're both superb movies, but um there were a lot of other movies that were expected to do that kind of business and just flopped, and so I think it's a difficult time in the industry because we are used to sitting at home. We are used to I think we're actually in a golden age of TV. I don't know that there's ever been as much. I mean, if you think about the history of TV and you think about the incredible television programs we have right now that are on these series, I mean, you just go to, look at Game of Thrones or you look at I mean, there's so much incredible TV right now. And with this whole sort of streaming model and 10 episode arcs for stories, it's really engaging because you can spend 2 or 3 days following a story and really watching all these episodes, and it's riveting. It's like a three long films, like Lord of the Rings series. um
Yeah.
and so I think that that will have an effect on what people go and see, because you go and see movies now in a movie theater and they can be, there was always that old term, well, it's a popcorn movie, it's just there, you go and eat your popcorn and you enjoy it and stuff blows up and people shoot, and and you realized it was kind of not a great story, but it was still fun to go and have popcorn and
Yeah.
watch it. And I think some of those films are not landing well because people are kind of like, well, I kind of want more interesting story, and I
Hmm.
just don't want to see the same old story retold. I want something that's, and television for free, you can pretty much sit at home and make your own
Yeah.
popcorn and watch it. And over 10 episodes, you can do a much deeper dive into the characters, into the story arcs, and make it far more interesting than a film which is pretty much limited to 2 hours.
I've
James
also
J.
noticed that. Yeah. Sorry. Like also noticed like people. They kind of they've been exposed more to the international arena as well, and
Right.
Hollywood's kind of like borrowing little motifs from different other cultures and integrating them into their scores as well. So it's kind of like a paradigm shift in a way for studios as well.
It really is. It really is. It's definitely in the industry right now. It's definitely quite an unknown time. We're still feeling, and what you've had is you've had really a lot of the bigger studios are gobbling up some of the other studios. Like Disney now owns Fox,
Hmm.
um, and Discovery just took over Warner Brothers,
Yeah.
and HBO. So there's this real kind of these kind of the numerous studios are starting to disappear, and it's starting to become these few kind of big powerhouses. And then you've got like Amazon and Netflix, which have just become their own behemoths,
Yeah.
with a completely different model. I mean, the old model of release a film, people come and see it in the movie theaters, and then it gets put out on TV is almost gone. People are quite happy to go onto Netflix or go onto Amazon, and stream the content. So that's had a huge effect on everything from budgets to the way that projects are conceived and sold and packaged. Um, so it's the dust has not settled, and then COVID only made stuff a lot worse, in terms of movie theaters
I
being
have.
shut
Yeah.
down. You know what I mean? It's like, how do we get movies back?
Uh,
uh, I mean, thankfully there's been some fantastic movies,
mm,
but again, I think a big surprise, the No Time to Die James Bond movie
mm,
didn't do great. And you're
yeah.
sitting here going, it's a fantastic Bond movie, and it was released, just on the tail end of COVID, so it was fighting that. But big
Yeah.
Bond movie didn't do great, and you're kind of like, well, it's strange times, because Bond movies have almost always done great. Um, uh, you
We live
know,
in unpredictable times, and
yeah.
to add to the list of everything that you just mentioned, I'm going to throw another wrench in the system where people are trying to still figure things out. Artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's coming. That's coming too, and I think that will have its own kind of interesting change to the landscape. But
Yeah.
no, I mean, thankfully, thankfully, I still get the fun of getting brought in on lots of different projects, and in different capacities too, which I enjoy. It's I was it's always nice to have variety. So, but yeah.
Yeah. Certainly, and like something I really wanted to talk to you about was also Brightburn, because that the film was, I think, completed for quite a while before it was released, or at least it was going to be teased at Comic Con, and then like a whole scandal kind of went about, and the
hmm
project got like hush hush. Were you guys working on it during that time,
No,
or was
I,
there kind
I,
of
I wasn't. It got put on hold, I think, for a period of
Mhm.
time.
Right?
Um, and then it got greenlit, and that process was fairly quick. I was very excited on that project because I got to record the score at Abbey Road. We didn't have a
Mm.
huge budget, so I had to be pretty judicial about the size of the orchestra and how I recorded it. But and Alan Myerson, who's a fantastic engineer, um, did just a beautiful mix of that, and it was fun because it was a real hybrid of
Yeah.
it was horror mashed with superhero plus orchestra and electronics and percussion. So
Yeah.
it was a fun score. It was definitely I think I wrote that in 2019, which I think was so far one of my busiest years ever. Um, but it was that again. It was a quick write. It was 2 months, I think, to write it, and it was
Did
it
you
was.
take any influence from the original Superman score? Maybe like flip it around. Or,
I didn't know. I think the big challenge with Brightburn was to create a score that lent a little bit into the superhero language, and I
Mm,
can't think of any other films at that time that really had that combination of, it's a horror film, but it's also about a superhero. And I think that in terms of tone was one of the hardest things to really come up with a theme that, or language that expressed that sort of off kilter
mm.
superhero. And I actually found just a straight 3 note theme that had some hope and some uh,
A sense of what could have been.
what could have been. Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
major seventh. I think it was bum bum bum.
Mm.
I don't know if I have a keyboard up here, but do I have a? Do I have a? I think I have a. So there was those three notes was the kind of the because it's
You
that sort
have a
of
bit of hope in there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so the idea was to create just a three note theme that
Mm.
would be. I mean that those three notes immediately sort of sound very sort of classically heroic, almost sort of
Which is why
Superman.
I kind of asked, like,
Yeah,
whether you reference Superman at any point.
yeah. I mean, not directly, but certainly sort of my
Yeah.
impression of what is hopeful, what could
Mm.
be a what could be a strong like theme of
Yeah.
if we did those in the French horns, and the strings, it could be like a big sort of heroic thing. And so what we did was we sort of I initially introduced that theme on the piano, and you hear it, and again it's presented very sort of hopefully initially, but what I did was I began. There were two techniques I used. One was to have the orchestra deliberately detune, play it out of tune.
Mm-hmm.
So they would hold chords, but they weren't completely in tune. They were
Right.
slowly pitch bending, which gives you this really sort of uneasy, like creepy.
Distortion, kind of.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's kind of wavering and not quite right.
Mm.
So it kind of gives you that nauseous, like, oh, something is unpleasant coming. So a lot of the cues as we progressed began to be more and more sort of deliberately bending the pitch and playing slightly out of tune so that it
Yeah.
felt off kilter. And then by the time it's done, you'll notice like at the very, very end of the movie, that whole theme just goes right down to the low brass, and it's done much more sort of aggressively and
Yeah.
dark and heavy. And I think that was sort of the thematic thing that I wove through it. Um, there was also another really interesting synth sound that I found that was kind of like it sort of went do,
Oh, yes.
and it was just that it sort of came in like in that restaurant sequence where the bright burn symbols all over the
Yes.
windows. It just starts. So for me, this was a little bit like the approaching shark. It was that idea of
In Jaws, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and same
Yeah.
in that big house scene where he's going through the house, and
Mm.
the policeman. Every time there's a little bit of silence or threat, that higher synth kind of comes in, and again, it's that sort of wavering pitch that again sort of feels like it could be that threat. And I think that's again that's an important part of film scoring is trying to find those sort of iconic things that in three notes I can play three notes and it can be the theme, or there's just that sound that begins that I haven't heard in another movie, but it just makes you go, oh, something's not good. Something bad is about to happen. So those things sort of take time. um
Yeah.
and
Because, like, ultimately, no matter what language the movie's set in or whatever, it'll appeal to everybody through the music. Like, they'll understand it on a much more subconscious level.
yeah,
That's the
that's
beauty of it.
yeah, I mean, ultimately film scoring is telling the story through music.
Mm.
And one of my favorite techniques is when the music is doing something that's completely counter to what you're seeing on screen. That's also something that's really really fun to do, where it's where you're just but it music always has a point of view. And that's often one of the questions I'll ask a director. I'll say, well, what point of view is the music from? Because like in that one scene in Brightburn, in the woods at the end, is the point of view the tragedy of what's happening? Is the point of view the terror of what's happening? Are we scared? Are we investing in the emotion of what we're seeing?
Mm.
Um, and I think that's often a discussion where I'll write a cue sometimes, and the director will say, "No, I think it should be more like this," and so it's a different point of view.
What's
Um,
your idealistic? So, when it comes to somebody giving you direction, what would you idealistically ask for? Like, I know this is something, that it's very subjective from like person to person, but you as a composer, What do you look for?
For me, it's two things. One is what is the story, and two, what is the emotion.
Hmm.
And I'll often have directors say to me, I'm so sorry, I don't really understand music. I can't give you musical terms for it. And my response is always the same. You don't have to. That's my job. Tell me what emotion. What do you want? How do you want the audience to feel? What's our point of view? What's the story? Tell me what's going on in the story. Tell me the point of view. Like, are we telling it from her point of view? Music can have so many point of views. It can be from way back where you're telling, hey, this is the location. Suddenly you hear the coconuts and you hear the taikos and the drums, and as you come into the sort of this wonderful, beautiful island, you're telling the story of that island. But then you sort of keep going in and you sort of zoom down into say a dead body, and
Hmm.
then the music can shift and
Shit,
tell the
yeah.
idea of, oh, well, this is darkening, and who killed this person. So
Hmm.
that idea of point of view, and again, you can also then cut to a crying girl, and then you're telling from her point of view would be, she's sad her mom got killed by the shark, or whatever it is. There's always that point of view. And so if you know what that point of view is, and even in that sort of scenario I just brought up, you've got the point of view of, are you telling the girl's story, or are you telling the horror of the fact that her mom's just been eaten by a shark? You know what I mean? It's like there's
Yeah.
two completely different ways you could score it. You
Why
could
are you telling it from the shark's point of view? It's just like,
yes, who's had a really good meal, and is happy. So that it's the point of view is really that's my question with directors
hmm,
is what's the point of view. And sometimes instinctively I'll get it right, and then sometimes directors will say, actually no, can we tell it more from this point of view here, or can we
yeah,
shift? And I think film scoring is also like even with commercials or adverts, there's always that shift. And so commercials do it on a very much tighter timeline, but with films, it's always, you've got to catch that shift in the drama, the shift in perspective, and know where that's happening.
true.
And again, that's something that you can get instinctively, but other times the director will say, no, can we, when we zoom away from the beautiful clouds and the lovely seawater, when we start to see the dead mom on the beach, can we shift it there when she starts to come into view? Or maybe we see a little bit of blood in the water first, and that's our
Yeah.
shift in
Hmm.
perspective. So it's
Hmm.
those sorts of things. Spielberg does it really, really well, where he talks about telling the larger story through the small details. And the famous one is the Jurassic Park, where you have that puddle of water,
Yes.
and you hear the thunk, and the puddle goes "Rulung," and
Yeah.
it's such a brilliant way to imply there's something absolutely massive out there that you can't see. And it starts the fear, because the you just hear the big thunk, and the puddle, it's told through the puddle of water. That's all it
True.
is. It's a puddle of water, but it's the vibration of the water that makes you, in your mind, suddenly imagine that there's a T-Rex just out of sight. Um, and so again, you're not scoring the puddle of water. You're scoring, the fact that you're beginning to bring in the fact that there's something incredibly dangerous and threatening out there that you can't see just yet. So that's a really interesting case of a point of view. One of
On
the
that note,
favorite.
yeah.
I
No,
was, I was
sorry.
just
Just
gonna I was just gonna
yeah.
finish off with one of the famous film scoring exercises they do, is they do this shot of this woman's, you just see her ankles and her feet walking down the
Hmm.
stairs, and all she does is walk down the stairs. And initially they put some very light comedic music to it, boom 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 boom, and you immediately think, oh, this is romantic comedy. She's heading off for the day, or
Hmm.
you're immediately in a happy mood. Then they show exactly the same scene of music, but they put really slow, high, creepy strings coming in, and these kind of low, and you immediately go, "Oh my goodness, she's about to be murdered,"
Yeah.
you know. And then they might do something else that's very emotional, and you go, "Oh, I'm in a drama, or I'm in something." And it's exactly the same piece of footage, but it just shows you the power of music, that can fill in so much in your mind of what the rest of the story is and the world that you're in.
Yeah, that's how powerful this is, and most people don't really realize the work that you guys put into it. That's what's sad. But before we close up, I have one final question. Is there any transferable skill from any other different walk of life that has kind of helped you with composing, orchestrating, and conducting?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Um, I think for me, one of the most important things in my job is kind of time management. And it
Hmm.
sounds very boring and very dull. Um, I worked
But
as a
it's everything.
I worked as a waiter for a long period of time, and just being organized and being able to get the right food to the right table at the right time, and just juggle, as a waiter. Um, that skill was really useful because it did help teach me sort of organization and the importance of delivering on time.
Hmm.
And it seems a strange connection, but it is very similar. You have a chef's creating this beautiful food, and you've got to get it to the table and make sure everyone at the table is having a good experience and that you're not forgetting anything. But that skill was a very good, like, precursor to being organized myself and delivering on time, and just sort of planning
Yeah.
planning the big job, but breaking it down into chunks. So I think that's the most important thing, and I think it's the skill. Certainly, when I get interns, it's one of the skills they struggle with, and it takes them a while to really. That's if they can be as talented as anything, but it takes a lot. And for me, it wasn't until I was in my 30s. I was a mess in my 20s, and it wasn't until my 30s where I was kind of like, maybe I should smarten up and get my life in shape. And I began to realize, yeah, you do need to. You just need to be disciplined in terms of how you use your time, how you allocate your time, to make sure that you're always um, on track, and that's tough. So I have lots of lists and helpful sort of, in the computer age we live in now, it's great because I get reminders of a point
Reminders.
of all this. You got to deliver this by then, you've got this then, and I can break it down. But I think that's a useful skill. I think people who can, who in general, I think, there's no getting around the hard work of the industry, of any
Mm.
industry, really. I think it's a good life lesson that you can be as talented as anything, but it's the hard work that gets you to the finish line. And I think that's the hardest part. It's certainly something I've struggled with, is not procrastinating. you know there's always something far more interesting, that I'd rather be doing sometimes, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
like, well, all right, I gotta focus and get this done. And I think that's the hardest part of the whole job. But I think people who in any industry work hard and focus, and are good in terms of people skills, and you know just being disciplined and getting everything
Mm.
done reliably, consistently. Everyone will do well who has that uh, mythology, I think. So
Golden nuggets of wisdom to end the conversation, my friend. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to do this.
my
Truly means a
pleasure.
lot.
Thank
And I'm
you.
hoping that we'll have you on board another time, sometime down the
Wonderful.
future.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so great to meet you.
likewise. Thank you so much, Timothy. And till next time, this is Junkyard Theory, folks.